Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very honored to be moderating this panel. Just a couple of logistics. One, we have live translation for one of our speakers, and we will also be featuring one of our other speakers on Zoom. So they told me once I activate it, then he will appear by naming him. It's sort of a, Voldemort concept, but happy. I challenged myself to make one Harry Potter joke, so there we go. We're done, never again, don't worry. Well, today we're here to consider legislative interventions to mitigate and blunt mis- and disinformation. And I'm particularly honored, perhaps even humbled, given this moment and the task before us. Our global information environment is, as we've heard today from a number of speakers, failing people around the world. Democracies thrive on local cohesion and connection, progress and expansion of opportunity, and trust in the rule of law. Large-scale disinformation and manipulation make these cornerstones of self-governance very hard to come by now. Maria Ressa, Nobel Peace Prize laureate and Rappler founder, warned, if you want to rip the heart out of a democracy, you go after the facts. Lies have just become culturally acceptable means of gaslighting the public and dismissing inconvenient facts, particularly potent when espoused by leaders with outsized digital presence. And I know we'll talk a little bit about that today. Malign actors spread chaos to remove cornerstones of civilized society and to give credence to what I think are really once unacceptable values. This chaos era weakens people's ability to make sense of what they see and hear and to engage directly in public life. As disinformation has gripped the world, it has cultivated a data ecosystem marked by social stagnation, democratic backsliding, and authoritarianism. And so we're here today to consider the role that lawmakers have in stepping in. Lawmakers around the world, including and namely the individuals on stage with me now, have been called to action. And it's such an honor to welcome all of these distinguished leaders, whose works have shaped the global fight against misinformation and defense of democratic integrity. So I'd like to start with introducing from Brazil, Orlando Silva. He has been a tireless advocate for digital rights, spearheading legislation to reform social media platforms and protect citizens from online manipulation, all while preserving freedom of expression. That's so often a tension that gets drawn, and I think it's one we'll really get into and correct why that's in many ways the wrong comparison and contrast. He served as rapporteur for the General Personal Data Protection Law and, most notably perhaps, the Fake News Bill, leading national efforts to regulate digital platforms. So join me in thanking and welcoming Congressman Orlando Silva. During his comments, we will be hearing from live translation, so you'll hear a little bit of an echo perhaps, and then broadcast from someone else who will be speaking in English.
A voz de Deus.
There we go. All right. Next, I'd love to introduce, and next to Orlando Silva, Alexandra Geese, who I have to say I was really fangirling meeting. She's been a member of the European Parliament since 2019, a leader for the European Union on issues of digital rights and freedom. In 2020, she joined the Special Committee on Artificial Intelligence in a Digital Age. Then, since 2021, she has been her parliamentary group's shadow rapporteur on the Digital Services Act. I know we'll talk quite a bit about the DSA today. And then finally, she's a member of the European Union's Special Committee on Democratic Shields. Is that right?
Democracy Shield.
Democracy Shield. Okay, so there we go. So join me in welcoming her. Thank you. And finally, in person, we have representing Wales, Adam Price, who brings a visionary approach to digital ethics, drawing from his background in technology and public service to champion a number of things: media literacy, civic empowerment. He's really long been concerned about the proliferation of public official lies. And Price has brought in legislation that would ban politicians from telling untruths. We'll also be getting into that. And it's interesting, while that bill had been tabled for some time, if the proposal had gone into law, Wales would be the first country in the world to make lying by politicians a criminal offense. He has consistently championed digital democracy, advocating for robust media regulation and proposing frameworks to counter misinformation, while, and this is I love, promoting Welsh language media resilience. So again, join me in welcoming Adam Price. And finally, from the word of the Zoom gods from the UK, and coming to us from London, we have Damian Collins. Oh, it's wonderful to see you. There you are. Damian Collins has earned international respect as a formidable force behind the UK Parliament's inquiry into disinformation and fake news. He's had a long history from the 2016 elections, examining what happened in the United States and the context around disinformation and the proliferation of lies in elections. He authored the influential Disinformation and Fake News Report, which at that time pushed for stronger oversight of social media platforms and political advertising transparency. And then over the years, he has continued to work with parliamentarians from around the world to consider data privacy, disinformation. In 2021, he was elected chair of the UK Parliament Joint Committee on the Draft Online Safety Bill, another regulatory piece that we will discuss. In 2022, he was made Parliamentary Undersecretary of State at the Department for Digital, Culture, Media, and Sport, including responsibility for making the Online Safety Bill law. So, finally, join me in welcoming Damian Collins. And now that we have 20 minutes left, here we go, let's get into it. I'd really love to hear from all of you. It's not 2016 anymore, and I think we've been dancing around this premise in all of the different panel discussions. Sort of everyone standing in relief from the way that things have changed or how we wish they had changed from 10 years ago. So much has happened in the world and in the ways that dis and misinformation have become more complex, more insidious, and more of a divisive concept themselves. So can all of you share for our audience where you're coming from today, the kinds of concerns and considerations you bring to the topic now when it comes to regulating mis and disinformation? And I think I'd like to start on the end, and we'll work our way around this way. Let's start with Mr. Price.
Well, I think the story of where we are is this, really. I think the roots of the crisis in democracy, the democratic recession, that's been with us for some time. I think the story of the last 10 years and where we are now is this, is that the democratic crisis was about the sort of, decline in trust. So we've seen, pretty much right across the democratic world, you've seen the graphs of the decline in trust in all kinds of institutions, including those at the heart of our democracy. What's happened in the last 10 years is that, something even worse has happened. We've moved from a crisis of trust to a crisis of truth. Why is that important? So it's not just that people don't believe in institutions anymore, they still don't. They don't believe increasingly in the entire concept of truth. And why is that important? Because many would argue that truth is a fundamental bedrock of democracy. And so, academics talk about the epistemic turn in thinking about democracy. So many of those who study democracy say that without truth, and this is Maria Ressa's point, that without truth you can't have a conversation, you can't have the national discourse unless there is some kind of common agreed framework, whereby you can agree on what is true and what is not. And so the crisis of truth is undermining the very fabric of democracy itself, and that's what's driving the process of autocratization that we see across the world.
Ms. Geese, please.
Let me go back to Maria Ressa, who has been mentioned twice, and rightly so. She's been and still is such an incredibly inspirational figure. In 2022, I was on a stage with her in Oslo, and she said 2024 could be the year that democracy globally ends. In 2022, that was an incredible statement, and the audience was frozen, and I thought, well, this is a little bit exaggerated, and then she explained why, and it was totally plausible. And I think this is exactly where we stand, because we have social media that drive polarization, toxic polarization, which basically means disinformation, and hate speech and harassment, which we have long treated as bugs of the system, but they are the feature. I mean, that's the whole point. It's the business model of social media, which serves authoritarian and illiberal forces who use disinformation and harassment and hate as an instrument to establish their regimes. And this is what we have been watching, for example, in the Philippines. This is where Maria Ressa comes from, in other countries, and now we are watching it develop in the US, and we're also seeing it in some European countries. It's not that this doesn't happen. I mean, let's just think of Hungary. In my country, Germany, today the far-right party stands at 26% in the polls. So this is absolutely shocking, and I'm scared. I'm really scared. Then there's a second point. Social media platforms are controlled by a handful of people who also control artificial intelligence, which is always mentioned as if it were some kind of abstract force. That's technology is controlled basically by the same set of people. There was an article a couple of 3 weeks ago on NewsGuard on how a Russian disinformation campaign called Pravda, The Truth, now is producing documents to put out on the internet, not to give to real people, but just to feed large language models, to feed AI chatbots, who then digest this, so they're trained on this, and 30% of the material is actually picked up and not recognized as disinformation, and then churn out the results of this as absolute truth for most people. So if that sets in, and it's already happening, it means that everything we say about media literacy, for example, becomes irrelevant, because how can people recognize what the different large language models and AI chatbots produce when these are broadly used also in academia? So the whole concept of truth will not exist anymore, and that without this we can't have democracy. So, and this is the same set of people who stood behind Donald Trump at the inauguration. So they are allies now with the most powerful government in the world. And they have an enormous concentration of capital, of control of data, of control of technology, and they don't want democracy anymore. I mean, people like Mark Andreessen and Peter Thiel are very clearly saying freedom, by which they mean not our freedom and normal people freedom, but their own freedom and democracy are not compatible anymore. This is formidable. The good news is that the European Union has worked a lot and does have legislative and also think other instruments to combat this, and it's time to do this.
Mr. Silva.
Boa tarde. É prazer participar desse encontro.
Pleasure to be here,
Quero agradecer particularmente ao querido Alan pela gentileza
for your kindness to invite me here today.
Eu tenho olhar local.
I see it locally
Trago
as a
a visão
local
do sul
issue.
global.
I see from the
O
point of
Brasil
view
um
of the
país que
global
tem
south.
pouco mais de 212
Brazil has
milhões de
just
habitantes.
over 212 million
2 de cada 3
inhabitants.
cidadãos
2
brasileiros
amongst every
estão
3
conectados às redes
citizens,
sociais.
they are connected to social networks.
Nós aproveitamos as
And
maravilhas das
we
redes
have
sociais,
made the most of
mas
social
sofremos efeitos
networks,
colaterais.
but we had collateral effects as well.
Pensar o combate à
Just to
desinformação
think on disinformation
vale
and
registrar
misinformation,
o
we need
apoio
to
à
record
produção de
here
informação.
the support on how information
Vale
is
a pena
produced.
pensar,
How
refletir
can we
sobre o
think and
jornalismo, o
reflect
futuro do
upon
jornalismo.
the future
A
of
produção de
journalism,
notícia,
the production of
jornalismo
news,
independente,
independent
livre,
journalism,
plural,
free, plural,
diverso e
diverse,
sustentável.
and sustainable.
Esse é um outro capítulo,
So this is
mas é
another
fundamento
chapter, but
essencial
it's a
para o
basic
combate à
foundation
desinformação.
for us to fight against
Hoje cedo
disinformation.
falamos
So
sobre
earlier
educação
today we
midiática,
talked about media
campanhas
literacy,
governamentais, políticas
campaigns,
públicas desde a
public
infância, mas
policies
para toda a
from
sociedade também,
childhood,
é
but for
segundo
the
fundamento
entire
essencial
society. So
para o
this is a
combate à
second
desinformação.
most important
E
point to
acredito
combat
que o terceiro pilar
disinformation. And I think
é a
that the third
regulação das
pillar
plataformas
is
digitais.
regulation of social networks and
Não é
platforms.
possível
It
que
is
um
not
punhado de
possible
empresas
for a bunch
do Vale
of
do
companies
Silício
from the Silicon
controlem a
Valley
dinâmica
to
social,
control
política e
social and
econômica do mundo
economic
inteiro,
dynamics in the entire
ferindo
world,
soberanias
they are harming
criando
sovereignty
culturas absolutamente
and
estranhas
creating very weird
vivências em vários
cultures
países.
in several countries.
Particularmente sobre
So
regulação.
particularly on
O debate que
regulation,
fazemos no
the
Brasil
debate we have in
aponta
Brazil
três
has
eixos principais:
pointing towards three axes:
liberdade,
freedom,
transparência e
transparency,
responsabilidade.
and accountability.
Liberdade de expressão.
Freedom of expression.
Defender a liberdade
We
de
have to
expressão
defend freedom
de
of
cada
expression
usuário.
of each
E a
user.
legislação
And
produzir
legislation
canais,
has to
obrigar a
have
existência de
channels.
canais
So we need to have
simples,
channels,
diretos,
bodies,
para que o próprio usuário
simple and direct
possa
for the
discutir
user
e contestar
themselves. They
a
can
regulação,
fight
a moderação de
against
conteúdo
any
que é feita pelas plataformas.
issues that they may have and deal with
Isso é
moderation.
permitir a
So
defesa
that
da
will
liberdade de expressão
allow
de
for
cada
us to have
usuário.
freedom of expression
mais,
for each user,
o
and
direito
beyond that,
de ser
the
ouvido.
right to be heard as
A
well.
liberdade de expressão
So
pressupõe falar,
freedom of speech
mas ser ouvido.
presupposes to
Para que haja
be able to
diálogo.
speak, but you have to be
A
heard, to
operação
have
de
a dialogue.
algoritmos
So
que produz
algorithms,
bolha
which are producing
interdita o
bubbles,
debate,
they
inviabiliza
stop
o pluralismo, o
debates,
debate, a
they
discussão
don't
e
foster
a plena
debates and
liberdade de
discussions
expressão.
and the full freedom of
O segundo
speech.
eixo, transparência.
And the other axis is transparency.
A sociedade
Society
precisa ter acesso
must
a
have
informações
access
na
to
operação desses
information
serviços
and
para verificar
access to
se há algum
services in
risco a
order
direitos
to see if
fundamentais.
there's any risk to
Inclusive, a
fundamental
academia
rights.
precisa
And
ter acesso
academia
aos
needs
dados
to
para
have
fazer as suas
access of
pesquisas.
data in
E
order
há
to do research.
obstáculos
And
crescentes
there are
no sentido
growing
de permitir a
obstacles
pesquisa
in
acadêmica.
allowing research,
Terceiro
academic
item,
research. And the third
responsabilidade.
point is accountability.
O Brasil,
Brazil,
herdando uma visão utópica da
we
internet
have an
no final do século
utopic
passado,
view of internet, which was
mantém na
fostered
sua
in the
legislação
previous
uma
century. We
inspiração
have in
da
the
lei americana,
legislation an inspiration
a
of
lei
the
das
American law.
telecomunicações de
So the telecommunications
1995,
law from
a sua famosa seção
1995,
230,
we have
que na
item
prática prevê uma
230, which
espécie
in
de
practice
imunidade para as
foresees
plataformas
a sort of
digitais
immunity
e
to digital
autorregulação.
platforms and
Isso
self-regulation.
poderia fazer sentido
That could
15 anos
make
atrás.
sense 15 years ago.
Hoje não mais.
However,
A
that
Europa deu
doesn't make
passos
sense
adiante.
anymore. So
O ato
EU
dos
has made
mercados
steps
digitais, o
forward,
ato dos serviços digitais.
and we
E
have
acredito que essa
digital laws
perspectiva
now,
precisa ser
and I think
desenvolvida,
that this
no nosso caso,
perspective must be
tropicalizada.
developed and
Mas a
adapted
ideia
to
de ter
Brazil. So the idea to
responsabilidade
have
para as plataformas
accountability for
digitais
social
quando há
platforms
produção de
when
danos,
there is
mesmo que
harmful
conteúdos de
content,
terceiros,
especially
é algo
if it's made
inescapável
from
de debatermos.
third parties, we
Seja
have
por
to
quando há
debate it.
ganhos, quando
Either
há
when they have
impulsionamento desses
gains, when
conteúdos e
they
produz
have
danos,
boost of
seja
this
quando há
harmful content,
omissão
or when there's an
dessas
omission
plataformas,
by the platforms to act
quando
against
notificadas,
harmful content
sobre
once they've
veiculação
been
de discursos de ódio
notified,
e de
when we have
conteúdos
hate
ilegais.
speech and
Portanto,
any
eu acredito, e é o
illegal
debate que
content.
fazemos lá,
So
que é
therefore, I
necessária uma
firmly
regulação
believe, and
como
we're
um dos fundamentos
debating
do
that
combate à
we need
desinformação,
regulation in order to
baseado
fight
na defesa da liberdade de
disinformation
expressão,
based on
em
freedom
obrigações
of
de
speech,
transparência e num
transparency,
regime próprio de
and
responsabilidades
in an
para as plataformas
accountability
digitais.
framework for digital platforms. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Silva. And finally, Mr. Collins, please.
Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to join you. I'm sorry I'm not at King's College at this moment, but I will be back in Cambridge later this evening and also tomorrow for the rest of the conference. The reason I think, if you like, parliaments have become interested in this question about disinformation distribution is a concern that through social media platforms, as for many people, the primary distributors of news and information, that there was a much greater prevalence of disinformation. So the news and information people might be receiving may too often be weighted towards things that simply weren't true. And that can cause real harms to society, but also harms to individuals as well. The issue with the definition of the term disinformation is that it is extraordinarily broad. Now, I think the efforts of regulators and legislators has been to try and establish clear lines of accountability and liability for social media platforms, to reject the idea that they are neutral distributors of content without any commercial interest or stake in what they are distributing. That is clearly not true. They're profiting from the content on their platforms. If they feel they can make more money out of fake news than real news, then we should know about that and be concerned about that. but they clearly should have a responsibility for content they actively curate, promote, and serve to users in order to make money out of that engagement. Now, within the description of what you might include in disinformation are some things that are clearly extremely bad and already illegal. Fraud is a form of disinformation. Foreign state interference in elections is illegal in most democratic countries, and is clearly something where distributors of content on their platforms that are allowing that to happen need to take clear lines of responsibility for it. Disinformation can be wrapped around campaigns of harassment or incitement. And again, in most countries, those acts break legal thresholds as well. So it's right that we should regulate there and ask companies to take responsibility for content on their platforms that breaches those areas of legal liability. What I think is very difficult for politicians to do, and not wise for them to do, is to try and arbitrate on political statements. I think at the end of the day, politicians have to be held to account for the things that they say and do, and they can be held to account through the ballot box or through other measures if that crosses more severe lines. And one of the areas where as countries have tried to legislate in this space, it has caused the greatest difficulty, is in believing that parliaments are trying to arbitrate on free speech. I think that is not what we've tried to do. What we've tried to do is make sure that the laws as they apply to speech in the offline world apply online as well, and that there are clear accountabilities and liabilities and responsibilities for the platforms to enforce that as well, and robust systems run by regulators that can take active measures against those companies if they don't. And I think that is where the challenge, I think, for Parliament and for legislators in this space is to be as specific as possible about what we mean by disinformation, where that breaches legal thresholds, if there are gaps where laws can be created to fill those gaps, and if they can't, then I think what we have to rely on is transparency, is calling out what is happening and supporting researchers and civil society in identifying those no problems and exposing them to, if platforms are allowing communities to thrive whose purpose is to interfere with democratic processes and spread information that we know to be lies. And I think that is the challenge. But the role for regulators and legislators is to create clear and robust systems where it's obvious to all what we're trying to enforce and the legal liability and responsibility is clear.
Well, some say that we're actually still in the relatively early days of regulating tech, which is somehow counterintuitive. You look at throughout the centuries, there's been regulatory efforts to address aviation and airlines, tobacco, food and drug. There are so many ways that different sectors have struggled. There's been tension. And one of the fundamental ones with this issue around disinformation is its complete, being one and the same as speech. And I guess tech, social media platforms have really been the primary driving vehicle that regulators turn to first. And yet, I think we have to acknowledge how difficult it is to actually regulate platforms. Each of you, in your own way, has spoken to the desperate need for transparency, the desperate need for accountability. We don't fully understand how platforms gather our data, what they do with that data, how they place users into cohorts and discriminate against users. We don't fully understand how they're leveraging their algorithms. I could go on about all the things we don't know, and I hope you'll talk a little bit about this, Alexandra, from the DSA side. And yet, I think really what we're looking at is that the platforms have existed and behaved as if they are beyond reproach. They've not only stopped some of the accountability measures they once promised, but they've rolled a lot of those efforts back. They've fired staff, they've removed policies. I think Musk, of course, has set such a wonderful example for how low the sub-basement can get. And so I'm curious, let's start, Alexandra, with you. Why is it so difficult to regulate these platforms?
Well, they are intransparent and they are huge. So the lobbying efforts are enormous. And it's very technical, and they very much insist on, when they speak to legislators, well, it's very technical, we can take care of this. What are you concerned about? And everybody, has a pet project in politics. It's like everybody else, might be the protection of minors or women or scams or marketplaces and so on. So that's what they're going to talk about. And nobody really looks behind the scenes and under the hood and into the machinery, how the algorithms work, how does the advertising system work, which is the really interesting part. That's where the money is, and this is where we need to look. And maybe to come a little bit to the DSA and what concrete measures could be, I think the DSA, the Digital Services Act, is addressing that. It's not falling into the trap in talking about only content moderation, which is a part, but it's not the huge element that we need to face, but it really gives the European Commission and in part the national enforcement agencies the power to look under the hood, to look into the algorithms, to look into the advertising system, to look into what they do with their data. And this is what we need to leverage now. And I have a proposal that I would like to share. It's based on Article 34 of the Digital Services Act, because you said we are in the early times. And it's true that it's early, but it's also true that if we don't do it now, we're not going to do it anymore, because we're not going to be there anymore. I will not get elected anymore if these authoritarian regimes continue to push their content and to push disinformation to voters. And I mean, you're seeing what's happening to your colleagues in the US, so we have to do it now or we're not going to do it. So what we could do, take this Article 34, it's the one on the systemic risk assessment that the very large online platforms have to do. Very large online platforms, according to the DSA, means more than 45 million users in the European Union. And the systemic risks that are mentioned are fundamental rights, but also then a series of other things: data protection, violence against women, protection of minors, and public discourse and elections, electoral processes. And this is what is relevant for us, because disinformation, in my view, is a systemic risk for public discourse and elections. That would give the European Commission, as the enforcement agency for the large online platforms, the power to investigate the mechanisms that lead to the prevalence of disinformation. I am very much against removing disinformation, save in very particular cases like health risks or something, or minors. But I think, especially as far as political speech is concerned, any kind of intervention needs to be content neutral. But the European Commission could investigate which mechanisms lead to the fact that disinformation spreads as fast or faster as information. You need to do good research designs, but the researchers can do that. And we do have clear definitions for disinformation. The results were probably a series of things. One of them, certainly engagement-based ranking. So content that is outrageous creates more engagement and therefore gets spread to more people, and the platform tell us, well, this is what people are interested in. No, this is not what people like. This is what people find shocking, and therefore they react to that, and the psychologists in the room can explain why. But it's not what people would choose when they are free to choose. So that's the first measure. And then these mechanisms like engagement-based ranking, and there's a few others that we will probably find, the Commission could just say, so we ban this, and you need to replace this with other mechanisms. There we have pro-social algorithms. There's a lot of research about pro-social algorithms. So algorithms that choose content that people from different political backgrounds or backgrounds anyway say, oh, this is interesting, this is enriching, this is something I like. Bridging algorithms. Or just users' choice, what was mentioned this morning, listener rights. So what we see right now is not what we choose. This is what they make us believe, but it's absolutely not true. So there's one a researcher from Poland who says, well, we could have these sliders, and there you say, well, I want more trustworthy journalism or less. In my entertainment part, I want soccer and cats. And I can change this every 2 weeks, and the platform just has to respect my choices. That is user's choice. And this is something that we could do. The problem is that obviously the pushback from the US government and from the platforms will be big, and this is why we need also a broad public support to do this. Mm-hmm. So that's a very easy thing. I think the second thing is reforming completely the online advertising market, which is now basically controlled by Google and Meta, who shut everybody else out. And the US, there's lawsuits going on, and they just established that Google is a monopolist. So very hard, strong, strict competition measures, courageous ones. This is what we should do in the European Union to give money back to publishers, because now the advertising revenue is flowing away from publishers, that is from legacy media, to social media and also legacy media have to adapt to the same mechanisms of creating outrageous, scandalous content in order to be clicked, because this is where the revenue comes from. So we need to change the advertising market. This is what it can do with competition law and partly with the DSA. And then I think the AI Act also is a very important instrument to make sure we really have transparency on what kind of contents and with what kind of modeling and weights large language models are trained on. Because if these are not optimized for facts, but for disinformation, we really have a big problem.
Damian, can I bring you in? I'm curious to hear from your thoughts, and with the perch in the UK, why is it so difficult to regulate tech companies?
Well, you need to have proper accountability, and that means regulators with legal powers. We've seen that what the tech companies call transparency reports deliver nothing of the sort. They are largely meaningless. You can't have access to the sort of source information behind it. You can't see the scale of the problems or how those problems are being managed within the companies in order to make decisions. And so you need to have regulators with legal powers to demand access to data and material from within those companies to see whether the companies are enforcing their own terms of service, what they promise to their users they will do, and that they're meeting their legal obligations as set out in the EU through the DSA and through the Online Safety Act in the UK. Now, can you make these companies adhere to domestic laws? Well, they certainly can from a technological point of view. If we all know that if you travel through different countries, even within the European continent, certain programs aren't accessible on certain platforms you might use because of licensing laws and the way content is licensed and sold. So the companies can respond to domestic legislation, even within the European content, and certainly on a wider level. So they've got the capability to do it. What we haven't had is the ability to require it. I think the challenge now of the Trump administration seeking to use trade negotiations to try and bake in American regulation of American companies in Europe and elsewhere in the world is something that they tried before. They tried it in the UK-US draft trade agreement the last time Donald Trump was president, and that was resisted, and it must be resisted again. We are right to set the laws that we think are responsible and necessary to keep our citizens safe. I think the wider challenge that Donald Trump has made that disinformation basically doesn't exist, is something that has to be challenged. In Germany, for example, Holocaust denial is a criminal offense. Are we to say, well, actually, whether the Holocaust happened or not is a matter of opinion rather than historical fact? And if the preponderance of people believe that it didn't, then it's perfectly legitimate to say that it didn't. I think these are the sort of serious issues that we have to confront when thinking about disinformation in the space of news and content. And as I said earlier on, there are also areas where I think there is already a very strong consensus around things like combating frauds and scams. That some of that is touched on in the UK legislation, but I think we do need to go further, where there are crimes being committed on social media platforms in plain sight that the companies have to be held responsible for, and that is clearly something where national legislation and regulation should take precedence. So we can and must do this. What we've gone through is a very lengthy process of trying to get this legislation right, and now taking enforcement against companies. I think actually, it's no accident that the big tech platforms have started to complain about this now and went to Donald Trump last year to try and get his support to repeal this legislation, because they can see now that they're going to have to respond to these laws that have been created. And I think also the mask has come off. We've gone through the last few years where the companies pretended to take trust and safety seriously, kept telling us they had policies in place to address these issues when they were really doing the bare minimum. Now the mask has been ripped off. They're now saying they're basically not going to do this stuff unless made to, and they're trying to make sure that the laws that make them are being repealed. I think they will fail in those efforts, and I think they also fail to understand actually just the rising level of public concern about this, because the lived experience of millions of people around the world has been the consequences and the harm that can be caused by bad and illegal content on social media platforms.
I think that's a great point. So often, the harms of disinformation feel only abstract at best and certainly distant from us. an individual, if you're not experiencing it, then what does it matter? Someone else just didn't vote because they changed their attitudes. Okay, so I think that's a fascinating point. We only have about 30 minutes left. I want people to start thinking about questions. I have a few more for everyone here, so we'll try to get through those quickly. There are other interventions to consider, and I want to turn to Mr. Silva and to Mr. Price, who have both been very active on thinking of other ways to come at this problem, that disinformation is not just a problem of media and tech companies. And I know, Mr. Silva, you already spoke a little bit to the need to turn to and view and support journalism as an antidote. Mr. Price, I know that you've also considered ways that disinformation is not just something we see and seed online, but there are ways that public officials themselves, with outsized power, promote some of the most toxic views. So can you each talk a little bit about some of the other types of interventions you've examined, what you're supporting and putting forth? I'll start with Mr. Price.
Yeah, first of all, I'd just like to say, the existential crisis that we're facing in democracy, if we were just fighting on one front, then, maybe we could easily win. But it's a polycrisis. We're fighting on three fronts simultaneously, and exactly the same in the 1930s. Three things come together: an economic crisis, new media, Leni Riefenstahl and all the rest of it, utilized by a kind of fascist ideology. Yeah. Come to today, we have an economic crisis that has been ongoing for some time. We have the new media that we've, not so new media, but that we've talked about. And we have an organized, illiberal international of autocratic movements out there that are using the new technology in a context where people have lost hope in conventional politics. Yeah? So that's the backdrop. And we have to fight on all those fronts. We have to find solutions in all three areas if we're to win. Let's talk about politicians that are utilizing the ability that social media prevents that the propagandists of the 1930s could only dream of. Yeah? We have to address that. And I think it's quite useful, actually, in this context to think about two thinkers who thought a lot about this question. Both of them emigres, exiles, refugees from Germany. So Hannah Arendt wrote a lot about the politics of lying. She came to the conclusion that actually she would have been with Damian on this. And she said you can't legislate to prevent politicians from lying. What you've got to have is you've got to have strong public realm institutions like academia and journalism to keep those politicians, those damned politicians, from lying, because they do, A contemporary of hers, Karl Löwenstein, came to diametrically the opposite view. He said that actually you have to, when democracy is under attack, democracy has to defend itself through legal and constitutional methods. You have to use legal methods to defend democracy. And he talked about, in a lecture in 1937, he talked to three countries in the 1930s in Europe, Finland, Czechoslovakia, and Switzerland, were the only ones that passed laws to make it a criminal offense to spread false rumors, the disinformation of the day. Three countries that didn't internally fall to fascism. So what Karl Löwenstein said is, look, we have to defend democracy from the enemies of democracy, and we have to make the spreading of deliberate deception for ideological reasons a criminal offense. And I'm very proud of the fact that my parliament and the government in Wales, the Welsh government, has said that we are going to be the first parliament, the first jurisdiction in the world to make deliberate deception by politicians an offense which will lead to their disqualification from politics through an independent judicial process, not decided by other politicians. Damian's right on this. You can't have politicians deciding whether a statement by another politician is true. But we have an independent judicial process. If you tell a lie as a company director when you want to sell shares, if you tell a lie in finance, if you tell a lie in advertising, there are strict rules about that. But politics, it's been a free-for-all. And at this time, when democracy is in grave crisis, we have to defend democracy from the enemies of democracy. And yes, we need to have a proper process about that, and we can talk a little bit about the elements that we're going to do. We'll have an opportunity for a politician to withdraw their statement. So it's a bit like self-certification that we heard about in the morning session in reverse. So if somebody challenges something you've said, you have the opportunity to say, well, hang on, the facts are different. You'll have the opportunity to withdraw that statement. But if you want to stick to that statement, even though it's demonstrably false, if that is proven in a court of law, then you will be forced to leave politics itself. We're in a crisis moment, and we have to arm ourselves in this way. There are other models out there as well in Australia, in South Australia, and in the Australian Capital Territory for over 20 years. They've had laws on political advertising, the truth in political advertising laws that have been very successful, proven demonstrably, and they have rooted out false statements from election campaigns in political advertising. So there are a range of tools that are out there that we need to use at this critical moment, because I think unless we do, then democracies will fall, one after the other, as they have begun to do so in the last few years. So we need to innovate, and we need to share the benefits of this learning around democracies. Otherwise, the lessons of the 1930s, as Karl Loewenstein would say if he was with us now, are pretty obvious.
Mr. Silva, can you talk a little bit about the legislative and regulatory solutions you've been fighting for in Brazil?
Muito bom a fala do Adam.
Very well, thank you, Adam.
Me parece que é necessário
And I
ter
think it's very necessary to have concepts and
bem
ideas
definidas para
which are very
defender,
well defined
e é
that we
necessário
need to defend
agir.
and we need to act.
é necessário agir.
We need to act
A ideia
now.
de defender
And the idea
instituições
to
é
defend
fundamental.
institutions
Reitero,
is
jornalismo,
key. So
reitero,
journalism,
educação midiática,
media education, literacy,
estruturas do Estado
structures
com tarefa
by the state
muito bem
which are
definida,
very well
para que nós
tasked
não
for
caiamos
us
na
not to
armadilha
fall into the
de que
trap
criaremos
that
ministérios
we'll
da
be able
verdade,
to create
que criaremos
ministries
estruturas
of truth
para ser
or
censores.
structures in order to censor
Não.
people. No, that's
Órgãos do
not what
Estado
we
que têm
have to
papel
do.
supervisor,
So we need
checar os
regulators
relatórios de
just to
transparência,
check transparency reports, for
checar
instance,
se o dever de
to
cuidado
check
está sendo
if the
cumprido
due diligence
e
is being
afastar
followed,
qualquer dúvida
and try
de
to
que não
eliminate any
caberá a
doubts
órgãos de
that
Estado analisar conteúdo,
state bodies won't be analyzing
de modo que o
content.
fantasma da
So
censura
that
seja
ghost of
afastado da sala,
censorship is
que é uma
completely removed
narrativa,
from the room.
uma
So this is
narrativa
a
comum em
narrative
muitos
that we keep
lugares.
hearing over and over again in many
Quando
places.
falo de agir,
When I talk about
é preciso
acting,
constatar
we
fato.
need to understand the fact.
Há uma aliança
There is an
macabra
alliance, a devious
entre Big
alliance
Tech
between the big
e a
techs
extrema-direita no
and
mundo.
the far right in the world.
Essa aliança
And this
é que
alliance
estabelece a
is
disputa
what
se
establishing
regularemos
this dispute.
essas
Are
plataformas
we going
digitais
to
ou
regulate
seguiremos com
platforms,
caminhos
digital
de
platforms? Are we
autorregulação
going to
que a
continue
essa
with
altura se mostram
self-regulation, which
ineficazes.
now are inefficient? We know
Essa
that.
aliança é
So
útil.
this alliance is very
Por um lado,
useful to them.
quem ganha
On the
com a
one
economia da
hand,
atenção,
those who are
quem fatura
winning with the
com a
attention
desinformação
economy
e o discurso
and
de ódio que
having
engaja
profiting,
pessoas nas
they are
redes.
profiting
E,
with
por outro lado, quem
engagement in
ganha
networks.
politicamente
And
com o
those
discurso
who are
de ódio, com o
profiting
discurso
from
extremo,
hate speech,
com o discurso
far-right
violento
speech,
que produz
and
votos.
violent speech,
Essa
because
aliança
that's bringing
é
votes. So
que
this
precisa ser
alliance
enfrentada por
needs
quem
to be
tem compromisso com a
fought
democracia.
because it is
Porque
damaging democracy.
para esse modelo
So
de
for
negócio,
this
ou
business
para quem tem
model
uma
to
perspectiva
continue, and
extremista,
for those
autoritária,
who are
a
in the
democracia
far-right,
é apenas um
democracy
detalhe.
is just a
A
detail.
universidade
So
é apenas um
universities,
detalhe.
academia
O
is
trabalho
just a
dos
detail.
pesquisadores
So the
são
work
detalhes.
of researchers is not important.
Rapidamente,
So
gostaria de
very
falar de
quickly,
uma
I just
experiência
want to talk
dramática
about
que
a
nós vivemos no
dramatic
Brasil.
experience we're
A
experiencing
professora
in
Marie
Brazil.
Santini está aqui entre
Marie
nós,
Santini is here with
líder
us,
do laboratório
professor.
da
She's the
Universidade
lead
Federal do Rio de
of the
Janeiro.
Federal
E
University
ao
of
final
Rio de
eu vou
Janeiro,
projetar um QR
and I
Code
will show a
para
QR
que quem tem
code
interesse
in the
possa
end
conhecer um
for you to be
relatório
able to
com
read her
evidências
report, which
que
has
demonstra
evidence
uma guerra que
facts
travamos no Brasil
showing
com
a
as Big
war
Techs
we are
em torno
fighting in Brazil with
da
big
regulação das
techs
plataformas
around
digitais,
regulating
em
digital
que foi uma
platforms.
guerra sem
It
regras.
was a war
Imagine,
without rules.
essas
Can you
empresas
imagine
falam todo
these
dia
companies,
que
they
são
are
apenas
saying every day
transmissores de
that they are just
conteúdos, não
showing
produzem.
content. They don't produce
Todas elas
anything.
produziram
All of
editoriais
them were
atacando
producing
a proposta de
news,
regulação. O
attacking
Telegram
our bill.
fez editorial
So
e
Telegram
distribuiu
has
para os seus usuários.
distributed a
Spotify,
note for their
que tem
users.
peso no Brasil,
Spotify, which is very
e
important
seus
in
termos de uso
Brazil,
proíbem
and their
anúncios
terms of
políticos.
use
Os termos de uso do
prohibit
Spotify proíbem anúncio político.
any
Veiculou
political
anúncio
adverts. They
atacando o projeto de
published a
lei.
political
Pago
message
pelo
contesting the
Google.
tax. It was
Atenção,
paid by
o Google
Google.
pagou.
So Google boosted
O
them
Google,
and paid
abaixo
them.
da sua
So
caixa,
Google,
onde você escreve a
below
palavra para
where
fazer a
you
busca,
do the
colocou um
search,
link,
they have put a
batizou
link
projeto de
and
lei
they
da
called
censura
it censorship
e argumentava,
bill.
venha saber
And they were
por que
arguing,
essa lei é
why
censor,
do you need
porque
to
essa
see
lei
why
ameaça a sua
censorship
liberdade.
is being
YouTube
built now
dirigia,
and
quando
why
se fazia
your freedom may
pesquisa
be
sobre esse
removed.
projeto,
And
para
every
os
time
vídeos e
someone
depoimentos dos
Googled the bill,
opositores da
they
matéria.
would just show
Nós vivemos
unfavorable
meses
links.
de
So
uma guerra
for
sem
months
trégua,
we've been
sem
fighting
critério,
with them.
sem
There's no
regra,
rules, no
porque há uma
criteria,
aliança
because there is an
que tem como
alliance
estratégia
which has
impedir
this
o
strategy
estabelecimento de
to
parâmetros,
try and not
regras,
have any
porque o que
rules,
importa é
any
independente da
framework,
democracia,
because regardless of
independente da
democracy,
liberdade,
regardless of
sustentar
freedom of
lucros
speech, they just
e
want profit and
obter poder.
they want power.
Essa é uma novidade.
So this
O
is a
alinhamento
new
das big
item. So
techs
the
com a
alignment
perspectiva
of big
ideológica
techs with the ideology of the
para
far
atender
right
seus
in
objetivos de
order
mercado.
to fulfill
O
their
desafio de
market
produzir
aims.
as leis
The challenge
exige
to
ter
bring
nitidez sobre
laws
quem é o adversário
make us think
e quem
who's our
procurará defender a
adversary
democracia
and
liberal,
who's
que
trying to
considero
defend
vive
democracy.
dias difíceis.
And it's a very, very hard time to do so now. Thank you.
I think we have to talk a little bit about free speech. It's sort of we've been dancing around it, and it's an odd premise right now, I think, that we have to confront the ways that even the study of disinformation and misinformation are under attack. It's sort of a meta additional layer of problem now. And when this phenomenon that lies proliferated around the world, that they impacted people, early legislative efforts, particularly in authoritarian and autocratic-friendly countries, lean towards just wholesale criminalizing what was called mis- or disinformation. The problem, whether it's in Singapore or China or Cambodia, these are all part of the growing list of countries that have introduced bills that would regulate misinformation and really attach criminal liability in very broad ways. All of those have really been used ultimately as a pretext to target political dissidents, to target media. And so there's this very odd moment, right, that we have to recognize alongside efforts to seemingly address mis- and disinformation. Certain kinds of illiberal and bigoted leaders use that to cling to their own way of cherry-picking speech. And in the same breath, I'll say in the United States, I've observed that there are other now authoritarian-friendly efforts to distort the harms of disinformation and its victims. You know, academics, those who study disinformation have come under attack. We've seen that there's a growing call to root out mis- and disinformation studies writ large. And that ultimately platforms themselves say, this is really a democracy problem. It's not us. The public square is just opened up. And so it's created this very compelling counter-narrative that disinformation is a pretext to violate people's free speech rights. Alexandra, I know you and I spoke a little bit before, and so I want to start with you. Again, I realize I've started with you a couple times, but you've had a lot of thoughts on this, and sort of how are we grappling with what free speech means? How are we protecting free speech on the one hand, accelerating what is a pro-expression environment while holding those accountable who are malign, who exist to profit off of and proliferate some of the worst content, and with horrible effect across the country and across the globe.
Yeah. I think this is one of the points where we really haven't understood how the far right has taken freedom of speech, which is, it's a progressive, it's a democratic concept, you know, it's bedrock of democracy, and have taken it and used it against the ones fighting for democratic societies. And I think we didn't take it seriously because it seems so absurd, and it still seems so absurd to me that right now the government that is persecuting academics, journalists, everybody, is still saying, well, Europe has an issue with freedom of speech. It's just absurd. I think those the 3 points I would like to make. First of all, I think in the US there is a different interpretation of freedom of speech than in Europe. Because the court in the US sanctioned that an algorithm used by a digital platform is covered by freedom of speech. So it's not about the freedom of speech of the individual, but of the person controlling that platform. So it's protecting Elon Musk's freedom of speech and the Mark Zuckerberg's freedom of speech, and it's protecting their freedom to decide what we see. So this is actually violating our freedom of information. And in the European concept of freedom of speech, you don't have that. It's not protecting the freedom of a company to limit what kind of information you have access to. And I think that is very important in the discussion. When Europeans and Americans speak to each other, they often don't know this, that it's really a different thing. And in Europe, we can still use the freedom of speech concept to say, well, this is the fact that Elon Musk on X chooses what German voters see during the German elections. 40% only far-right content. The second most boosted account that German voters saw was Alex Jones in English. You know, this is not what people choose. This is what Elon Musk chooses. The first one was Elon Musk himself, obviously. This is not what Germans chose. This is a very clear breach of the freedom of being informed of German voters. So this concept that freedom of speech is also the freedom to have access to information. You know, in Germany, we care a lot about media pluralism. I think this is really important, and we really have to reconquer this concept. So that's, I think, the first thing. Freedom of speech is not the freedom of an enterprise to manipulate me, but it's normal people's freedom to speak openly, not to have reach, but to have speech, and to be informed and have access to an information space where you also find facts and different opinions. I think this is something we have to say loud and clear in Europe. The second one is freedom of speech for all. I think this is the point Orlando Silva was making as well, and we have heard from the previous panel, women don't have freedom of speech on this planet because you always have to fear hate campaigns against you. And this is not only true for academics or for journalists or for politicians. I talk to very normal women who say, well, you know, I commented I was going to this event and I got a series of hate comments on Facebook. I just got off. You know, women my age, if they don't have professional reasons, they're not on social media usually. Or they just do like beauty stuff, but they don't comment politics, they're afraid. And there's studies on this in Germany very clearly. Not to speak of marginalized communities, people working with refugees, climate, all the hot topics. We don't have freedom of speech for everybody, we don't. So this is something we would need to reframe and fight and say we need freedom of speech for all, and harassment and hate campaigns are an attack against freedom of speech. And in democratic society, probably the biggest attack freedom of speech that we have right now. And the third one, I was really surprised last week. There was this article in The Economist that got a really big attention in Germany, saying that freedom of speech in Germany is under attack. And it brought the example, not even of the Holocaust denial, which is famous in Germany, which I totally stand by, and I think it's really for good reasons. But it was the case of the editor-in-chief of a far-right magazine linked to the AfD party, who posted a picture of the German Minister for Interior Affairs, who had been holding up a sign expressing solidarity for some cause I can't remember, and he replaced the words on the sign and said, "I hate freedom of speech." And she sued him, and she won. Because this is defamation. You know, he put words in her mouth that she had never said. And as everybody who has ever been an object of a harassment campaign very well knows, this has very concrete consequences for your life, for your political engagement. I mean, how many times in your life are you going to do this? for a politician, it means you can't go anywhere without police protection anymore. I mean, this is a massive attack on your freedom of speech. How can we allow that defamation is considered freedom of speech? This is not an opinion. This is really stating a false, manipulative, and extremely harmful false fact about that person, and it's a specific political attack. So that the Economist, serious media outlet, says this is freedom of opinion, and defending yourself against defamation is an attack on freedom of speech. I think this is really, really risky, and this is something we really have to go against. And that this comes on top from American circles that are super religious is really crazy, because, I mean, the fifth commandment is thou shalt not bear false witness against your neighbor. I mean, this is exactly it. So why are we fighting for this, and why are we not able to turn that narrative around? And I think this is what we need to do, and I very much support one of the women on the previous panel says, I think, Alex, let's not just hold the lines, but let's attack, let's push that line. Let's say, no, it's us, we want freedom of speech. And we want to stop Mark Zuckerberg, and we want to stop Elon Musk from taking it away. I think this is what we need to do, really attack them and define what real freedom of speech is and go for it. And let's not just hold the line, but push it further.
Yeah, so just to build upon, I think that useful distinction that we've heard about the two traditions, if you like, in terms of European discourse and American discourse traditionally, if we generalize, there is this more holistic approach to freedom of expression. And you know, you can say, you know, the deep roots go back even as far as, you know, Immanuel Kant, who had a lot to say about truth and how it was a violation, really, and a manipulation of somebody else to lie to them, because that interfered with somebody else's autonomy, their right to make up their own mind in full possession of the facts. And so, you know, freedom of expression, my freedom of expression also means that I have a right not to be lied to. I have freedom of information. Otherwise, freedom of expression, it's bogus, yeah? Because I'm being fed a pack of lies. And you can see that reflected, as I said earlier, in then the discussion of democracy. And so people like Jürgen Habermas talking about the need, in order for people to have democratic debate, it's a foundational right not to be lied to. Otherwise, again, democracy becomes a sham. So, you know, there are different traditions. It has to be said, though, you know, given where we are, you can see echoes of some of that European thinking in people like Michael Sandel, also talking about the right not to be lied to. So maybe we're, you know, the ideas now, because of the moment that we're living through, this is a very, very live debate. I take that holistic view. I think that, you know, and of course the fact that, yes, autocratic regimes, Putin and all the others, they use fake news, and, you know, who says fake news more than any other politician at the moment? Who has his own social media called Truth Social, yeah? Of course, they pretend to be the friends. The biggest liars pretend to be the friends of truth. That doesn't mean that we should then be confused or diverted from the very necessary task of putting in proper legal and constitutional defenses of truth. The fact that they when they actually do take power, then use these terms in order to, you know, to sort of utilize their power and abuse their power, that shouldn't confuse us from the very necessary task that we have to prevent more autocrats from getting into power, which is to put those defense lines in place in a variety of different ways that we've heard discussed.
Well, I know we're coming up on time and we have some questions from the audience. I just want to summarize something, and I really do hope we can address in some of the final comments from Orlando and from Damian. I feel if we're going to talk about free speech and expression, we have to talk about power. And both of you spoke to that in various ways. Orlando, I was reading about you before today, and I found this wonderful quote, something that you said, and I hope the translation came across, but you said of autocratic figures like Musk and others, you said, they assess that they are winning in an environment without rules, in which hate speech, attacks on democracy, violations of rights all take place in a digital environment. And so if they feel there are no rules, if they feel that they can just pay for access in the front row of the United States inauguration for Donald Trump, that they can pay for and have easy access to essentially shirking all responsibility, that's really about power. And it means that there is the sort of counterpart of who's suffering when they don't get to tell their story, when they don't have access to legal resources. I've heard that now from each of you in some ways, and so I think it's critical, and the audience here today, we have almost, 200 people here, more that will watch this ultimately online, that we have elected officials, all of these on stage with me and Damian on Zoom, who are actively trying, who are making a rigorous effort to correct course, to do the thing where you fight in a proactive way for something better. And in the middle of what feels like an incredibly overwhelming wave of autocracy, of lies, of normalization of misogyny and bigotry, we have to have leaders who will say, that is wrong. That is not where we want to stand. We want to stand on the right side of history. So before we get into questions, I want to thank you all, because I think that is, you walk the walk, and we need you. We need you every day. We need the practice of democracy in the ways that you do your work. And so I want to thank you. I want to open it up for questions. I see Alan is standing in the back, and there are so many.
Yeah, before all the hands go up, we're going to have time for two questions.
I would urge women to raise their hands as well.
Only because we have to be out for 2 hours for them to set up for dinner. So we're going to do 2 questions. Keep in mind that we will have time to talk to them as well at the drinks reception too. Anyway, our first question's here.
Thank you so much. Sarah, and I come from NATO, so I'm taking this from a military perspective. We know that with the shift in the autocratic regimes and the opening up of the information environment, we have adversaries that see our civilian populations, and particularly the journalists and scientists in this room, as absolutely legitimate military targets. Classically, the military has not been comfortable playing in a space which we want to leave open, and we feel it belongs to the politicians and civil society. But we're aware that there are attacks happening there that we need to be defending against them. What do you see as the military's role working with politics and working with broader society to help in this space? Thank you so much.
I would open it up to any of our wonderful panelists.
Well, can I just come in on that quickly to say, in the context of the UK legislation, the National Security Act is one of the priority illegal offences that are listed on the face of the Online Safety Act as it was passed. So what that means is when we can identify networks of foreign state interference that are attacking our country from outside of it, that's a regulatory offence that the platforms have to respond to. So if they get told by security services that we've identified networks of accounts operating on their platform that are being controlled for malign purposes by a hostile foreign state, they need to take action against those. Now, they should do it under the National Security Act anyway, but they also need to do it as a regulatory matter under the Online Safety Act too. So I think what we need to do is look at how we bring together different arms of government and make sure that we see effective enforcement. I think if it is a network of accounts being controlled by a hostile state that's being used to target and potentially incite harm against UK citizens, whatever their role may be, then we need to take robust action against that. And that's not a question about someone's free speech rights. That's a security matter that we should deal with appropriately.
Okay, we have time for one more.
Can I?
Line of sight here.
Right.
Oh, you have one. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you so much for a really fascinating perspectives. I'm Juliana von Reppert-Bismarck, and I'm the founder and executive director of Lie Detectors. We're a media literacy organization that works on the intersection of education, media, and digital rights. We were in the high-level expert group that gave birth to the code of practice that accompanies the Digital Services Act in Brussels. and we were on the steering committee of the structural indicators of the Code of Practice. So we've had a real look into the inner workings, you know, of a lot of this regulation. And we see, and I'm coming to a question in a minute, but we see a lot of reticence in Brussels of confrontation with the platforms, when the platforms have been facilitating anti-hate speech campaigns that the Commission can't do because of criticisms of censorship. But also a place where, you know, Google, it's one of the main donors for the flagship initiatives on fact-checking and media literacy. So we see a lot of reticence there, continued reticence, a continued desire to focus on fact-checking rather than demonetizing. And I really agree with what Alexandra was saying on the need to take on the algorithms and the money, follow the money, demonetize disinformation in that way. But what we also wonder about
we're running on time.
How do
please.
may I just very shortly?
Super
what
short.
we also wonder about is how can politicians reconcile the need to dissemble the information silos, the echo chambers that are unraveling the national conversations, with the need and with your own reliance on these information silos to make for precise messaging that you rely on as elected officials. How can politicians take a step to actually undo the kind of precise messaging that they rely on in the interest of democracy? Who has to take the first step, and via what regulation? Thank you.
A tall order, I would say.
Well, I think that
Adam.
what did we do in the earlier age? You know, we created this concept of a public service broadcaster, which didn't exist until it was invented. You know, we need to think about what that could look like in our era. Everything's changed because now in the last few years because one, you know, you can use whatever epithet you want to describe him, but you know, one plutocrat, Elon Musk, basically bought up Twitter, turned it into X, and turned it into this cesspit that you know most of us you know have left or are leaving now. We need to create you know new tools and new forms of public realm, which are the equivalent for our era of those public service broadcasters, public interest journalism. How do we fund that? How do we create it? Not just regulating the bad actors and trying to, you know, we need to do that as well, but actually how do we create our own pro-public interest good actors? And how do we fund it?
Well, I in no way want to support giving politicians special treatment. But Alan has very kindly said that we are allowed to have closing remarks from our luminaries. So I'd love to open it up to all of you now. And given the discussion, we have these wonderful officials who will be with us for the next few hours, I believe. You can come to them. I've seen so many questions. I want to thank you all. I want to thank the Cambridge Disinformation Summit. Alan, thank you so much for the wonderful stage. Can I start with Damian, and then I'll go to Orlando, Adam, and then Alexandra. I'd love to just hear how, in closing, you come away with what your next priorities are. These are urgent tasks, and I think people are hungry for solutions. They want to feel like, even if they don't have the sphere of influence, you know, that you all do, there's something coming. And so I'd love to hear, where are you moving? What are you thinking about next?
Sure. So I mean, we're at a critical moment because we're now seeing the enforcement and the regulatory enforcement of the legislation that we've created. So I think the next year is going to be about whether that is delivering in the way that we expected it would when it was passed. But really, the most important thing is that for the regime to be effective, you need two things. You need regulatory oversight, the ability to get access to information that companies would otherwise hold back on to see whether they are complying, and it has to be proactive. There has to be the sense of the companies have to scan the horizon. They have to look at their recommendation tools and their algorithms that power and drive the systems. It can't be reactive. If we rely simply on after the fact checking and content removal on a case-by-case basis, then we will have failed. The obligations have to be proactive, and the companies have to be scanning the horizon, and we have to make sure that they do. There are other big areas too. I mean, advertising, which is what fuels all these systems. I mean, Google and Meta are advertising companies at the end of the day. Most of what happens in the advertising space is outside of these regulatory movements. So we have to be concerned about that, and we have to be robust in making sure trade policy and tariff policy is not used to water down the legislation that we've passed, simply because the American tech companies would rather not go to the time and expense of complying with it.
Thank you so much, Damian. Orlando.
Duas questões.
Two issues here.
A desinformação é um fenômeno global.
Disinformation is a global
A
phenomenon,
solução precisa, de
and the
algum modo, também ser
solution
global.
needs to be global
Seja
as well,
pela cooperação
either
política,
by political
seja pela cooperação
cooperation
acadêmica,
or academic
seja pela integração
cooperation,
de
or
Estados que
through
precisam agir
integrating
para
and working
defender
with other
a sua
states
soberania
who need to
e o
act to
interesse de
defend
seus
their
cidadãos.
sovereignty and the
Esse espaço
interest
aqui
of
é um
their
exemplo, um bom
citizens.
exemplo
So this
de
summit
cooperação
here
global
is an
para
example of
enfrentar
global
o desafio da
cooperation
desinformação.
to face and combat disinformation.
Segunda questão.
Second issue.
Decisão dos países.
So
No
countries
Brasil,
must decide.
nós
In
estamos
Brazil,
decididos
we are
a
decided
enfrentar
to
os
fight
monopólios,
against
enfrentar a
monopolies
desinformação.
and fight
No
against
parlamento,
disinformation.
seguimos
Both in
trabalhando
Parliament, we're
pacientemente
working with
para
a lot
construir
of
uma maioria
patience to
e
build a
aprovar uma lei nos
majority
termos
and
que eu apresentei
approve
aqui.
the bill
Mas como
upon the
uma
terms I
democracia
presented
liberal,
to you today.
o
But
Brasil
as a liberal
possui
democracy,
uma corte
Brazil
constitucional
has
autônoma
a Supreme
que tem
Court which
cumprido
is
papel importante.
autonomous, and they have
Após
fulfilled
a
a very
tentativa de
important
golpe no
role.
Brasil, em
After
8 de
the
janeiro de 2023, que foi uma cópia da invasão do Capitólio, coube ao Poder Judiciário
which
agir.
copied what happened
Elon
in the
Musk
Capitol.
nos acusou de autoritarismo.
Elon Musk
A
accused
decisão
us
judicial do
of
Brasil foi
being
cumprida
authoritarian because we shut down
após
Twitter.
a suspensão do
And
serviço do
after
Twitter
all
no Brasil.
services were suspended in
Não era
Brazil
problema
from
de
X,
autoritarismo.
it wasn't an
Tanto que
issue
mesmo
of
os
being
brasileiros
authoritarian.
prejudicados com o não uso
Even
do
the
Twitter por um
Brazilians
período,
were not
não
able
se
to use
opuseram à
Twitter.
decisão,
They were not
porque a lei
opposed to the
precisa
decision
ser
to take
cumprida
down Twitter because
em
they
cada
need to
país.
follow the law
É um
everywhere.
exemplo de
So
uma
this is an
iniciativa em
example
outra
of an
estrutura do Estado,
initiative
no Poder
by the
Judiciário,
Supreme
mas que
Court,
revela a
which
nossa
has
determinação.
shown our
Apesar de sabermos que é
So,
preciso
although we are
cooperar
aware that we
internacionalmente,
need to cooperate
aprender com as boas
internationally, we need
experiências,
to
e para mim isso aqui é um
understand and
paraíso.
learn from best practices.
Observar
So to me, this has
evidências
been
que podem
amazing.
nutrir
I
as
saw
iniciativas de um
evidence which
parlamentar
can
num país
help
do sul global, com
us
as
in
suas
the global
particularidades,
south
mas
with
que está
our
decidido a fazer no
specificities,
espaço
but we
virtual
are
um ambiente mais
decided to
saudável
create
para a
a
vida
better
e para a
environment,
democracia.
digital environment for life and for democracy. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad that you mentioned January 8th. We had such little time. Adam, please, small closing remarks.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think that we are facing a global fight. It's universal, it's urgent, but it's not unwinnable. You know, so I come away from today more hopeful than I was. We've got to. I think we've got to utilize the sort of ideas of Louis Brandeis's idea of the laboratories of democracy. Right? We've got to experiment. We are conducting our own experiment in Wales. So please come to Wales, connect with us. It won't be perfect, you know, but you know, we'll do what we can do, and then you can take some of our ideas, adapt them, and improve them. And we need to create this global alliance, really, from with Karl Löwenstein in mind, of democracy defenders. That's what we need to think as ourselves, in our own different ways, in our own different contexts, but as part of a wider movement, and that is how we'll win.
I love it. I think I'm sensing some calls to action here. Alexandra.
Yeah, first of all, I totally agree with what Damian said on how to enforce the regulations we have. So changing the business model, changing the advertising model, changing the algorithms, that is absolutely essential. But my trust in achieving big enough progress there to really make the existing companies turn them into really democratic free internet is limited. So I think what we need to do, especially in Europe at the same time, is building new social media. And using this moment with the tariff confrontation and this rift that is being created with the US, where we can't rely on them as a partner anymore, and using this momentum to build our own companies. And there's one initiative that I would like to mention, which is called Free Our Feeds, which comes from civil society. They're trying to take the AT protocol that underlies Blue Sky and putting that into foundation with a few conditionalities, and then people could build social media, better social media. We don't have the time to go into what that would look like, algorithmic pluralism, democracy, safety, and so on for Europe. I think this is what we need to do. The second thing we need to do to underpin this is to get independent from the enormous power concentration of these companies. 80% of the digital services and products we use in Europe are from these companies in the end. Are American, and that means we need to build a tech industry, because if we don't have our own cloud system, they can just switch off our social networks. And they did that. AWS, 2020, I think, they shut off Parler, which at the same time was a far-right network. So this can happen to us as well. So we need to get not only out of this communication and information system dependency, but also of the dependency of the whole digital infrastructure, which also underpins our industry. And this is something we can only do on a global scale. I think Europe should give a big push, but Brazil plays an important role. And I know that Brazil is working also on the BRICS level on digital sovereignty. India is building the India stack. Taiwan has an absolutely essential role in digital democracy, but also semiconductor industry. So teaming up globally to build a better digital world, a democratic world, and that is also in an industrial way built on open standards, on open protocols. I think this is really a great chance also to come back to a really democratic information system.
Well, thank you all, and please will all of you join me in a round of applause. Thank you so much.